Okay, welcome. This is the interaction facilitated webinar on the IASC Protection Policy and what does that mean for NGOs. It's great to have a number of you online. We're expecting a few more to join the webinar over the next few minutes, but we've also had a number of people confirm that they will be listening to the webinar back. They can't make the time right now, so we are recording this webinar and we will be sending the link out following the webinar. So that many more people can listen to the webinar today. To maintain the sound quality with so many participants, your microphones have been muted and they will stay that way throughout the session today. But please feel free to submit questions at any point via the questions box to the right of your screen. You'll see there are two options. There's one that says questions. If you could use that one for any questions that you've got for our speakers today. And then if you'll also see a box marked chat. And so if there are any points that you want to raise, if you want to engage with anybody else who's on the webinar, please feel free to use that chat box to communicate between one another. But as I said, anything that comes to mind during the webinar, use that questions box, and we'll be going through that with the speakers at the end, towards the end of the webinar. So let's get started. What's the purpose of this webinar today? Let me just make my screen large for you. So, what's the purpose of the webinar? What we're hoping to do today is to highlight the background, the drafting process, and the key content with a particular focus on the relevance and implications for NGOs. We'll also be looking to outline the next steps in terms of the rollout and implementation of the policy. We recently had a strategy discussion, which I know a number of you on the webinar today were also part of, with NGOs to identify a range of potential tools, and we're keen to build on that further today. It's also an opportunity today for participants to ask questions regarding the policy and propose rollout and implementation strategies that they've identified within their own organisations. I'd like to start by introducing our speakers, and we've got some excellent speakers today that have been really involved in the drafting of this policy. Jenny McAvoy is the Director of Protection at Interaction, and she was the co-chair of the IASC task team on protection priority, which oversaw the whole of system review and the subsequent drafting of the IASC Protection Policy. She'll provide a brief overview of how the policy came into existence and will also respond to any questions that you may have. We also have online Brooke Lauten, who's the Humanitarian Policy and Protection Advisor at the Norwegian Refugee Council. She played a prominent role in the drafting of this policy as a member of the task team, and she'll explain the content of the policy and also respond to any questions that you may have. My name is Liz Bloomfield. I'm the Programme Manager for Protection at Interaction, and I'm your primary point of contact on the protection policy here at Interaction. And I'm also facilitating the work of Interaction's Protection Working Group as it relates to the policy. I'll be monitoring your questions as we go through the webinar today, and any suggestions that you might submit via the questions box, posing those to the presenters accordingly. So please interact with the webinar. Please feel free to raise things in those boxes, as we're really very keen to get your input. So let me now pass over to Jenny, and she will introduce where this all started.
Hello, everyone. Glad to have so many people joining this webinar today. So I'll provide a bit of background on this policy. Perhaps to kick off, just to mention what is the IASC. The IASC is the Interagency Standing Committee. It is the policy-making body of the international humanitarian system, and it consists of UN agencies, 3 NGO consortia, including Interaction, representing the broader international NGO community, and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, including IFRC and ICRC as observers. So in October 2013, the Interagency Standing Committee agreed to focus on protection in humanitarian action as one of their strategic priorities for 2014 to 2016. And this decision was motivated in part by the findings and recommendations of the Secretary General's internal review panel on United Nations action in Sri Lanka. This was a special panel set up by the Secretary General to look into what the United Nations did or didn't do in the very last stages of the war in Sri Lanka, particularly in 2009. And it identified systemic failure on the part of humanitarian, human rights, and diplomatic and political entities of the UN in terms of appropriate responses to pervasive and targeted attacks on civilians. Now, while this was very much an internal UN report, there was widespread recognition across the humanitarian community, including amongst the NGOs, that in fact, this recognition of systemic failure in Sri Lanka and failure to ensure the protection of civilians in Sri Lanka applied equally to non-UN entities as well. This led to the UN Human Rights Upfront initiative and a renewed focus on protection within the UN system. But there was a felt need to do the same within the broader international humanitarian community. This was the reason for the adoption of protection as a priority. In 2000, sorry, maybe I should just backtrack a little bit. So on having identified this as a strategic priority, the IASC created a task team on the protection priority. This task team was co-chaired by Interaction and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It involved the participation of 8 UN agencies, 5 NGOs, the Global Protection Cluster Coordinator, and the Child Protection and GBV areas of responsibility under the Global Protection Cluster. And there were 3 tasks set out. The first was to develop a statement on the centrality of protection in humanitarian action. I hope this is well known to most participants by now. It was adopted by the IASC principles in December 2013, reaffirming that all humanitarian actors have a responsibility to place protection at the center of humanitarian action and emphasize the role of humanitarian coordinators, humanitarian country teams, and all clusters to implement this commitment in all aspects of humanitarian action. Based on this, the IASC subsequently commissioned an independent whole-of-system review on protection in the context of humanitarian action in order to determine whether the international humanitarian system was in fact well positioned to fulfill this aspiration as set out in the centrality of protection statement. And if not, what measures should be taken to strengthen its ability to achieve protection outcomes and give effect to this statement. This independent whole-of-system review was completed and widely circulated in May 2015. And it spoke to the third task as set out by the IASC, and that is the development of an IASC protection policy. And it emphasized that this policy should spell out core principles, approaches, roles, and responsibilities within and beyond the humanitarian system, as well as the elements critical to a robust and strategic response. So this became the basis for the development of the IASC protection policy, which we're discussing today. This was drafted through an interagency process under the task team and was subsequently adopted by the IASC principles 2 months ago in October 2016. It sets out how the centrality of protection will be fulfilled in practice. It includes definitions, responsibilities, and some guidance on implementation of the policy across the international humanitarian system. In addition, just to flag that concurrent with the drafting of the IASC Protection Policy, the Global Protection Cluster also developed guidance on humanitarian country team protection strategies. This guidance should be read together with the IASC Protection Policy. It speaks a little bit more to the how, what it actually looks like to implement some core components of the protection policy, which speaks to the critical role of HCs and humanitarian country teams. The intent behind this is that protection strategies should be light and seek to enhance the effectiveness and performance of national level humanitarian responses addressing critical, severe, widespread protection concerns. So now perhaps just very briefly to walk through some of the most critical elements of the policy. And then Brooke will walk us through the structure and the substance of the policy itself. First, just to emphasize that the policy and the drafting process was very much oriented towards taking a whole of system approach to address the most severe and widespread protection risk. Partly out of recognition, as identified in the independent whole of system review, that while there were sort of activities geared towards addressing protection concerns in the countries that were looked at, there was a tendency to avoid sort of more strategic responses to tackle the most difficult, the most severe, and the most widespread of protection risks. So the approach to the policy is very much oriented towards mobilizing the range of capacities and mandates across the humanitarian system to tackle these pervasive problems. It provides an overarching framework for a multidisciplinary response. It defines the centrality of protection in humanitarian action as well as its process in order to achieve that at a country level. It emphasizes the responsibilities of different actors, again, emphasizing the lead roles of humanitarian coordinators and humanitarian country teams, including through HCT protection strategies, and a commitment to undertake certain activities throughout the entirety of the humanitarian program cycle in order to achieve protection outcomes. It also recognizes that outcomes may require contributions from non-humanitarian actors, while of course, maintaining respect for humanitarian principles and seeking to maximize the complementarity across a range of actors. So some non-humanitarian actors which may have a critical role to contribute to a protection outcome include UN peacekeeping or political missions or special envoys, development actors, conflict resolution actors, those with diplomatic capacities to bring to bear on crises and so on. Lastly, just to note, quite critically, this policy does not seek to duplicate or replace the many useful and specialized protection tools and guidance which are available. These all remain very relevant to designing response, ensuring the quality of response, the relevant response, and what have you. Rather, the approach of the policy is to reinforce and enhance the complementarities of unique roles, mandates, and expertise across the humanitarian system. With that, perhaps I can now hand over to Brooke, who will lead us through what the policy says in more detail.
And Brooke, can you just confirm that you're back online?
Okay. So
just to let you know, we have got Brooke Lauten from NRC, who was with us and is going to be talking through some of the detail of the content of the policy. I'm sure you'll all appreciate that there's a lot of things going on in the humanitarian world right now, and Brooke actually had to step away to do some press interviews that are overrunning a little. She's very keen to get to join us again, but obviously you'll appreciate that she's having to finish that particular task right now. So Jenny's going to continue with the detail of the policy, and Brooke will join us later on in the session. So thank you for your understanding in accommodating this operational demand on Brooke's part.
So going deeper into the policy itself, and if you have a copy in front of you, you can follow along as we walk through the various sections. So first, the background and the purpose of the policy very briefly sets out the general context where people are at risk. It reiterates the importance of international humanitarian law and human rights law, and seeks to complement other initiatives in support of protection. It goes on to define the centrality of protection in humanitarian action, and it reiterates the IASC definition of protection, which everyone is familiar with: all activities aimed at obtaining full respect for the rights of the individual in accordance with the letter and the spirit of relevant bodies of law. The policy goes further to clarify that for a humanitarian response to be outcome-oriented, it is essential to understand and seek to prevent, mitigate, or end actual and potential risks and violations, which are producing the harm that affected persons experience during a conflict or indeed a disaster. This requires a continuous analysis of risks, namely that threats, vulnerabilities, and capacities of affected persons, and that's vulnerabilities vis-a-vis specific threats and capacities vis-a-vis specific threats, must be understood, must be identified, and the commitment and capacities of duty bearers to address these risk factors must be understood. The expectation is that this analysis then provides the evidence base for programming, for advocacy, for dialogue, for the purpose of influencing and changing behaviors and policies in support of actual reduction of risk and the creation of a protective environment. So following through on the analysis, you would expect this to then be parlayed into very practical measures to reduce the risk factors, to reduce the threats, reduce the vulnerabilities, and enhance the capacities, avoid exacerbating risks, stop and prevent violations, and avoid reinforcing patterns of behavior which are giving rise to violence, abuse, coercion, and deliberate deprivation. The policy then goes on to look at responsibilities, whereby all humanitarian actors, irrespective of their sector-specific expertise, can contribute to protection of affected persons in four broad ways. In the first instance, to address protection concerns that intersect with their formal mandates and sector-specific responsibilities. So if your specialist expertise and your programming lies in the area of wash or food, then the expectation is protection concerns which intersect with your area of work can and should be addressed. Secondly, to engage collectively to achieve meaningful protection outcomes. This means a broader overarching protection strategy involving four interrelated and ongoing commitments, as well as the full engagement of HCs, HCTs, and all clusters. There are four main areas or aspects to fulfilling this comprehensive approach to protection outcomes. Data and information collection, sharing and management, in-depth and integrated protection analysis, agreement on protection priorities and collective actions, and continuous monitoring and evaluation. It goes on to identify the critical relevance of mobilizing a range of actors to contribute to collective protection outcomes. As mentioned earlier, these might be political or peacekeeping missions, development actors, conflict resolution, special envoys, diplomatic actors, and so on. And finally, the critical importance of evaluating and monitoring progress to place protection at the center of humanitarian action. It should build on the continuous analysis that was mentioned earlier, but I think places critical importance on the role of the HPT to keep an eye on the overarching strategic protection outcome that the broader humanitarian community is aiming for. The policy then goes on to look at implementation. And it looks at a range of the levels of leadership required to ensure that the policy is being implemented, to ensure that protection outcomes are being achieved. And there's a range of examples included in the policy. It's not intended to be exhaustive, but simply to illustrate what some examples of implementation may look like. So, for example, implementation of the policy would be manifested in the comprehensive analysis of protection risks, detailed disaggregation of threats, vulnerabilities, and capacity throughout a humanitarian response, and very much synchronized with the humanitarian program cycle, including during recovery and transition to development phases. HCs and HCTs reporting on and supported to make progress towards protection outcomes, including the technical capacity and the resources required for them to do so and provide that leadership on behalf of the broader humanitarian community. And indeed the role of affected people themselves, including through meaningful and consistent engagement and people's involvement in decision-making affecting their lives.
Thank you, Jenny, for stepping in there. And I know we now have Brooke on the line. Brooke, thank you for joining us. And we explained the circumstances, so completely understood. Brooke, would you be able to just pick up on as we move through the annexes?
Yep, sure. Just to say, in terms of the annexes, I think one of the things that was important was that there was a lot that sort of we initially wanted to put in the policy that found its places in the annexes, but so while they're annexes, they still are quite important, I would say. So we have the first annex to the policy, which really provides the normative framework and goes into much more detail about international humanitarian law, human rights law, refugee law, the role of domestic and national laws, as well as traditional social and cultural norms. The second annex gives a bit more detail on the roles and responsibilities that the various actors play in ensuring the centrality of protection is implemented. It should be said that this is not an exhaustive list of everyone who is meant to have to play some role, that it was really looking at sort of the key players with the perspective coming from the IASC and as a result the HC and the HCT at the country level. So yeah, I think as Jenny said, there's a role for a wide range of actors to play in ensuring the implementation of this policy, and the roles and responsibilities that are outlined in the second annex shouldn't be taken as exhaustive, but does provide a bit more meat to what those roles are specifically in relation to the centrality of protection. The third annex looks at guidance for information management, and it's guidance that's provided by the GPC, the IASC, OCHA, ICRC, Danish Refugee Council, UNHCR, OHCHR, the Child Protection AOR. So it provides quite a large range of information management tools. And the fourth annex is looking at a framework for protection activities. So it specifically describes and gives examples of responsive action, remedial action, and environment building action, so roughly categorized as the EGG model, and sets out modes of protective action in terms of persuasion, mobilization, denunciation, support, and substitution. Finally, the fifth annex provides reference documents and standards along thematic lines. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but there are key documents that have informed the policy and the thinking around centrality of protection.
Thank you, Brooke. That's great, and thanks for being able to join us. And it's great to have you on the line in order to respond to some of the questions that we received both before the webinar and hopefully we will receive from participants shortly. So if you are online, please start thinking about those questions and entering them into the questions box. What we just wanted to do in the final part of the presentation is to talk about how this policy is being rolled out and how it should be implemented. So there are a number of different work streams and actors involved in that already, including the Interagency Standing Committee, the IASC, as Jenny outlined earlier. The IASC decided not to establish a task team to oversee the rollout and implementation of the protection policy, but they have asked the Global Protection Cluster, the GPC, to follow up. And indeed, the GPC coordinator is already active in terms of overseeing the translation of the policy into both Arabic and French, as well as engaging with the IASC's Emergency Directors Group, the EDG, and the Normative Agenda Implementation Team, the state, as well as the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, regarding the rollout. So those discussions have started and will continue in the coming weeks. From our own perspective here at Interaction, our protection working group has already begun work on the rollout and implementation of this policy, particularly within the NGO community. We've established a task team which is currently focused on mapping and engaging some of the key actors. Also started to think about developing supporting tools such as presentations, fact sheets, and infographics, whatever is needed to help make the policy accessible and usable to the people that it's relevant to. We're in the early in 2017, we will be compiling a self-audit tool for agencies to identify their strengths and any gaps they may have, and in order to help them in their rollout and implementation of the policy. And we've also started to think about identifying mechanisms to monitor the progress with implementation of the policy. I mentioned there an actor mapping exercise, and there are a number of key actors that it will play a really important role in the rollout and implementation of this policy. This includes a cross-section of humanitarian and development actors, and it's important for us to help them identify their role in the implementation of the policy. For example, helping specific actors identify the relevance of the policy to their work. This may be child protection, gender-based violence, housing, land and property, mine action, helping make the links about how the work that they're doing. Look, I'm just going to place you on hold for a minute, on mute for a minute because I have noise from you. I will then once we get to the question section. Thanks. Yeah, so one of the ways that we're seeking to address that at Interaction is we're planning a series of webinars in early 2017 focused on some of the specific areas of protection, such as GBV and child protection, and we'll be seeking to bring a range of actors into those discussions to really have a close look at how the protection policy is relevant to their specific areas of work. There will also be an important role for the IASC's Emergency Directors Group, as well as the OCHA Humanitarian Leadership Strengthening Unit, and we'll be keen to engage with that work and ensure that there's alignment in the initiatives that are going on. One of the things that's already been spoken about on a number of occasions is the importance of involving donors in the rollout and implementation of the policy, and that really will be essential. Initial discussions have already begun, and it will be a case of building upon those existing relationships, such as exist within the Global Protection Cluster Donor Dialogue Task Team. Apologies, that's a little bit of a mouthful. And the Interaction Biannual Dialogue, Protection Dialogue that takes place with the US government. Those are just two examples of where existing relationships already exist and where there have already been some initial conversations regarding the policy. But I think another important point to emphasize, and something that we discussed a little on the NGO strategic discussion last week, was that NGOs should also think about how to convene collective dialogue with donors at field level. And I think that's something as NGOs we need to think about how we can push that forward. As I mentioned earlier, we've already had some initial discussions about potential supporting tools. So although the policy itself is just 10 pages and the policy together with the annexes is longer at 40, it still may be it may appear a little inaccessible to people that have busy jobs and don't necessarily have the time to sit and read a policy that has a lot of pages to it. And so we need to think about how we can develop tools that can really make that policy accessible and make the links in terms of the relevance to people's work. But the conversations that we've had so far with NGOs have emphasised that it makes a lot of sense for NGOs to work collaboratively in the preparation of these tools so as to avoid duplication of efforts across individual NGOs. But this will require a commitment of time and resources to ensure that the burden is shared, and that's something here at Interaction we're keen to engage with people, but we'll be looking for input from other NGOs as we go through that process. So far, ideas include a Prezi or YouTube overview that can be saved somewhere that's easily accessible and people can use for their own briefings with their staff or their managers around what the protection policy is all about, as well as fact sheets and infographics, posters, potentially e-learning or further webinars similar to the one we're doing today, and potentially even in-person training that gives people time to reflect upon how the policy is relevant to their areas of work. But as I mentioned, we're looking for as many NGOs as possible to contribute to the development of these tools, and we'll also be seeking to engage with other actors via the Global Protection Cluster to avoid duplication of efforts. And then finally, just talking through some of the first steps needed towards implementation of the policy at field level. And the starting point, of course, is dissemination of the policy, but it might seem obvious, but also ensuring that people are reading and understanding the policy. Dissemination is one thing, but with people's very full inboxes, actually carving out the time and the priority for people to read and really internalize what the policy is saying will be really important. From there, it will be important to ensure there's discussion of the policy within key fora, such as the HCT and the protection cluster, as well as other clusters, but not limited to those groups, about having a dialogue about the policy and really seeking to reflect on what that means in terms of the way in which we all operate. And then from there, identifying the need for adjustments to ways of working, which will need to be approached in a very conscious and deliberate way. It's not something that will just happen. It will need actors to be really thinking proactively about how to do that. As an example, there are clear expectations on protection clusters within the policy to produce a certain kind of analysis, which will have implications for how they work and will have implications for how information is managed. And this will need to be planned and thought about in a proactive way. So that was just intended to give you an overview of some of the key aspects of rollout and implementation to complement the overview from Jenny around the background and from Brooke and Jenny on the content of the policy itself. But what we've really tried to do is reserve as much time as possible to take your questions. As I said, we have had a few come in prior to the webinar, but we're really keen to get yours. So what I will be doing now is turning off the screen share so that I can monitor your questions in the question box. But in order to get us started, I just thought I'd start with a question, and perhaps Jenny, you can have a look at, you can give us your thoughts on how do you think the, let's think about the NGO perspective. How can NGOs push humanitarian coordinators and humanitarian country teams to fulfill their responsibilities as set out within the policy?
Sure. So I think, you know, NGOs quite often underestimate their ability to influence the overall strategy and approach, and, you know, the nature of discussions taking place in interagency fora. And I think implementation of this policy and ultimately, you know, achieving protection outcomes in a much more robust and strategic way depends on NGOs really seizing, recognizing and seizing their influence. And quite often this is best achieved collectively. So I think it's incredibly valuable for NGOs to come together and say, right, you know, what are the most critical protection issues? How do we want to see these tackled? And bring those conversations into the interagency fora. Certainly protection clusters, but also HCTs. Every country in the world now that has an HCT involves NGO representation on HCTs. It's typically at least 4 NGOs representing the broader NGO community. So I think it's critical, you know, perhaps in the first instance, to ask for an HCT agenda item focused on the policy. Ensure that everyone reads it. There's a discussion about what that means for ways of working. The HCT should certainly send a demand signal to the protection cluster and the broader community of actors for analysis, for you know, strategic proposals, and communicate its intention to not neglect, but instead to proactively seek to address the most severe and the most critical protection concerns. So as a starting point, you know, I think it will be critical for NGOs, you know, to establish that early momentum and get the conversation going, and to subsequently help to maintain that momentum over time.
Thanks, Jenny. Just to answer a quick question that's more to do with the conduct of the webinar rather than content. But Leah, you asked whether it would be possible to share the presentation. The webinar is actually being recorded, and a link will be shared following the webinar today. So you'll be able to access anything that you missed as a result of joining a little bit late. So no problem there at all. As I said before, we haven't had any questions come in yet via the questions box. So if anybody who's online, if you have any questions, then please do pop them into the question box, and we'll put them to our presenters. Let's do a question for Brooke. Brooke, how do you think the policy will help us to achieve better protection outcomes for affected people? And I'm just going to take you off mute at the same time. Sorry about this. There we go, Brooke, you're off mute now. Just to say that again, how will the policy help us to achieve better protection outcomes for affected people? And you may want to think about particularly how that policy will be integrated into the humanitarian program cycle, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of maybe jumping on Jenny's response to the last question in terms of talking about this, I think something that's important to consider about the policy is it can be a really good tool to motivate action. That I think, you know, it is something that's been signed on to, and that, you know, assuming we can get the awareness out there, it's something that NGOs can really capitalize on as a tool to push initiatives forward to get protective more protective action and protection outcomes for affected people. So I think in terms of a starting point, it's something that can be sort of referred back to and integrated into a number of processes, including the humanitarian program cycle. So I think in terms of some of the larger processes like the HNO, the HRPs, etc., that it sort of naturally feeds into this, and I think it naturally is something that can give more weight to looking at protection from that holistic perspective and really influencing the variety of initiatives that are taken on. And then I think it ultimately, though, is meant to be that starting point and that sort of added voice that shows the commitment to these issues. So I think it's something that, you know, it doesn't solve everything, but I think it is something that gives a lot of weight to these discussions that it maybe didn't have in the past, and that we can really, as a protection community, sort of push that forward.
Maybe just to add and build on what Brooke just said, one of the things that we commonly hear from NGOs in the field is that, you know, the humanitarian program cycle, you know, feels, you know, like a burden. It's too linear, too sort of almost mechanistic. Whereas how we need to work in protection is a lot more fluid, a lot more iterative, and certainly this protection policy describes that much more iterative approach, whereby continuous analysis should allow you to continually adapt and adjust your strategies, working towards a protection outcome. And I think it'll be important for the NGO community in the course of going through the humanitarian program cycle and implementing the IASC protection policy, sort of look at, you know, provide feedback into the broader system about how to ensure that the humanitarian program cycle works for protection. You know, we shouldn't view it as overly limiting. We shouldn't view it as a straitjacket. And you know, essentially reflect on what is it going to take in order to shift gears towards a much more outcome-oriented approach to protection, which is at the heart of this policy. Related to that, I think it'll be critical for NGOs to be quite active in helping protection clusters shift gears a little bit. You know, perhaps come to terms in the first place with the implications for this policy, which sets out quite a clear expectation that protection clusters as a primary role must invest in a certain type of analysis and certain approaches to analysis of protection concerns in order to inform HCs, HCTs, as well as protection cluster strategies. So, you know, that's going to require some thought to think through the staffing implications, the implications for ways of working, you know, how that analysis work is resourced, how it's made use of, you know, across the humanitarian system. Arguably, you know, NGOs produce some of the best protection analysis in the humanitarian community and therefore should be quite well positioned. I think, to support and indeed facilitate that process.
Thanks, Jenny. We've had a couple of questions come in around responsibilities and accountabilities. I'm going to ask together because they are linked. So Dale, thanks for your question. Starting off with, how have the HCs and HCTs been brought up to speed on the policy and their roles and responsibilities beyond the mere sharing of the policy? That's the first part of the question, but I think if our presenters could, in their responses, could also respond to a question that's come from a couple of people on the call, which is, how are they, the HC and the HCT, as well as we as NGOs, accountable? And that's to another question that's coming: who would be accountable for implementation of the HCT protection strategy? And Martha, thank you. You've mentioned that we are developing at the moment a commitment which should be followed by the protection advocacy strategy. What does it mean that what does it mean that the whole humanitarian actors have responsibility to ensure protection? What does that mean in practice? So, Jenny, shall I start with you?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with the last question. What does it mean that all humanitarian actors have a responsibility? And I think that the starting point perhaps is a recognition that quite often, in order to comprehensively address protection concerns and indeed, solve the problem when it comes to the types of risks that people are facing, for the most part, it's going to require a multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary response in order to achieve the desired outcome, in order to comprehensively and definitively reduce risk, reduce the threat, reduce the vulnerabilities, and enhance the relevant capacities. So if we need multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary responses, that means that the actors that need to be mobilized towards a protection outcome aren't just the people that have protection in their job titles. We may need livelihoods specialists. We may need food security specialists. We may need specialists in healthcare, or the medical actors involved. So if we understand the detailed patterns of violence, of coercion, of deprivation that people are facing, we'll be better positioned to know what sectors and what disciplines need to be mobilized. So when it comes to whole-of-system approaches to protection, it's basically a recognition that solutions aren't going to come from just one group of actors. It's going to need to come from a range of actors. So then, what does that mean then for the role of HCs and HCTs? I mean, number one, sort of empowering HCs and indeed, articulating this expectation that they will lead and spearhead an effort to ensure that these sort of cross-cutting and multidisciplinary strategies are defined and are implemented. HCTs are a natural fora where this conversation should take place and where the overarching strategy and approach of a humanitarian response should be defined. Placing the commitments and the resources of individual entities behind a strategy, and maintaining an ongoing sort of monitoring role to ensure that that the desired reduction of risk is actually achieved over time. I think that the challenge is indeed, how will they be held accountable? Accountability of individual organizations and of interagency fora within our humanitarian system is perhaps one of our biggest challenges. I do feel quite strongly that accountability comes first and foremost at the most local possible level. And that means in the case of this protection policy at the country level, and the critical role of NGOs to not allow issues to slide, to constantly be bringing them up, and so on. Beyond that, I think we need to ensure that the momentum and the conversation is kept alive at HQ and international levels, with individual agencies who have critical roles to play, but also interagency fora like the Global Protection Cluster and the IASC. I think an incredibly useful outcome of robust NGO engagement in implementation of the protection policy could be identifying ways to strengthen accountability. for implementation not only of the protection policy, but for HCT protection strategies that are adopted. So a group of NGOs are involved in crafting that HCT protection strategy. You know, what is the context-specific way that accountability should be pursued, and can that be built into the strategy itself? In terms of HC and HCTs and whether they've been brought up to speed, the policy was only adopted in October, so fairly recently, and it has been disseminated to HCs. But as far as I know, there have not been detailed conversations with them yet. One, we very much hope that this will be pushed at the field level, that those conversations take place. But if you see a particular need for HCs to be brought up to speed in a more substantive way, you know, we hope that people will flag that, and we can try to push that through the Global Protection Cluster, the IASC, or indeed, you know, a group of NGOs could seek a dialogue with particular HCs about policy implementation. So I think it's still early days yet to know exactly who is up to speed and who is not. And I think we'll see that unfold over the next few months, particularly once NGOs start pushing for attention to the policy. Brooke, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, maybe just, I mean, I think it's important to remember that the policy is not the guidance. And in terms of holding the HCs and the HCTs accountable, the thing that we ultimately want to hold them accountable for is responding to the protection risks and threats that are identified. So I think I think what Jenny suggested in terms of building sort of the accountability mechanism in more robustly into the rollout of this policy and into the way that it's implemented at the country level is going to be an important element of the next steps. And I think it will be extremely important for NGOs to be on the forefront of that. You know, there is a sort of intrinsic theoretical accountability to the IASC, and therefore, you know, in terms of just hierarchy, a certain amount of leverage, I suppose you could say, that we have on some of these agencies and organizations. But I think really in terms of ensuring that we get the outcomes that we want and using the protection policy as a way to do it, it really is that starting off point. And I think the next phase where we really are rolling it out is where there's a real opportunity to strengthen accountability, as Jenny was saying.
So one idea that came up actually in the NGO strategy discussion a couple of weeks ago is, you know, whether we as NGOs might want to work together to track progress at a country level for implementation of the policy, for, you know, say based on identification of the critical protection risks, you know, development of strategies, implementation of those strategies, accountability for those strategies, and so on. And if we did that over the course of 2017, then perhaps, you know, towards the end of the year, we collectively as NGOs could put out a brief report, you know, sharing our observations and, you know, potentially identifying gaps and recommendations to enhance implementation of the policy, but also, you know, the range of efforts to achieve protection outcomes. That was just one idea that was thrown out, but if people think that that's worth doing, I think we'd certainly be interested to hear that.
Jenny, we have had another question come in, which I'll pose to you now. While the policy emphasises the need to prioritise the most severe protection issues, in practical terms, how is prioritisation done, especially considering multiple actor interests? So could you elaborate a little on how a causal logic may support the analysis and prioritization of key issues. And I'll start with Jenny, if that's okay.
Sure. So there were some pretty detailed discussions looking at, how indeed do you prioritize? And I think there's a couple of factors there, and some of them are in fact elaborated in the HCT Protection Strategy guidance. Now, the focus taken in that guidance is about how an issue moves from protection cluster level strategies to the HC or HCT level. And there are a couple of things. I think one is the degree to which an affected population prioritizes a particular issue, identifies it as the thing that affects them most, and where they would place priorities and where they would place expectations, I guess, on the humanitarian community. I think that's an overwhelming factor. Now, at the same time, we need to recognize that we may not be in a position to carry out full and meaningful consultations with affected people due to being overwhelmed by violence, due to inaccessibility of a certain population. So we need to rely on other sources of information and other indicators as well. In some instances, the overwhelming priority may be so obvious that it doesn't even require consultation. We need only to look at Syria and Yemen these days to get a sense of that. So in terms of identifying then, which are the most severe, I think this really needs to be defined in a context-specific sort of way in terms of what are the threats and vulnerabilities which pose the greatest threat to life and the possibility of survival for a group of people. But I would also place a lot of emphasis on prevalence. And there's some debate within the humanitarian community about whether that's a relevant measure. But I do think we need to look at, how widespread a particular risk is. And we may find that, having identified, the most severe and the most prevalent risks, it may be that addressing those risks is well within the capacity of the protection cluster to address at the protection cluster level. So indeed, the emphasis of the HCT protection strategy guidance is those issues which should move from the protection cluster to the HCT are the issues which cannot be addressed at the protection cluster level and requires the broader mobilization of actors beyond those protection specialists. So it may be, for example, if you've got a prevalent, widespread case of gender-based violence, perhaps deliberately targeting certain segments of a population with gender-based violence, that demands preventive strategies and response strategies, which mobilizes a broader cross-section of humanitarian actors and, exceeds the capacity of the protection cluster to do that mobilization. So I think the how to prioritize sort of, needs to take into account those variables. Now, as far as a causal logic goes, I think that the causal logic should follow on the analysis. If the analysis is able to break down all of the risk factors, it should lend itself to, number one, the articulation of the desired protective outcome. And then the causal logic essentially charts out the pathways and sets out, who the critical actors should be and the critical milestones and activities between the current situation as described in the protection analysis and the outcome that we want to achieve. By setting out that causal logic, it creates a way for a range of actors to come together and identify their particular role, their particular contribution towards that outcome, and indeed allows us to set out some assumptions. You know, if the assumption that, you know, if we do A, that will lead to B, that will lead to C, and so on, and to be able to chart our progress along the way or adjust course as needed. Brooke, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say practically, I think this is one of the most complicated things that we deal with, because the reality is we come in as individual organizations and agencies that have particular expertise and have a tendency to look towards the protection concerns that sort of link to our expertise. So, you know, not minimizing that, I think this, what Jenny was emphasizing with the analysis, I mean, I think it was a very conscious decision in terms of the protection policy of really focusing on that analysis piece, well, throughout, but before going into the question of roles and responsibilities, and trying to take that step away kind of from the thinking around who does what, but rather really looking at the context that we're dealing with. So in terms of, I mean, I think it's sometimes, I wouldn't say easier, but with some of the larger threats where you have lots of different organizations that can respond in lots of different ways that all contribute to the ultimate outcome that we're trying to achieve, is in some ways more conducive to that group work, if you will, than prioritizing one threat over another, in the sense that, yeah, the natural tendency, I think, within our sector is to move towards that part that you're good at, or the part that you know, or the part that your organization you know, is able to really intervene on. I think there's sort of a balance between complementarity and prioritization that needs to be struck, and I think by really emphasizing the analysis from the outset, as well as throughout the process, that hopefully that provides at least some of the fuel for that complementarity.
And maybe building on that a little bit further, one of the issues identified in the independent whole of system review was that the existing tendency within the humanitarian community to go towards, you know, predetermined vulnerable groups and predetermined responses in activities, you know, almost cut and paste, you know, from one context to another. And I think that's what Brooke was speaking to a little bit, in terms of organizations having their own specialized modalities and areas of expertise. So I think, you know, the analysis piece is critical in order to avoid predetermining, while ultimately, you know, through the process of developing a causal logic, still allowing organizations to come forward with their unique capacities and skills, but not allowing sort of unique areas of focus to be too prescriptive in terms of defining what the response should be.
Yeah, exactly.
Any further questions online? So if you do have any final questions, please put them into the question box now on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will do our best to address those. But one thing I would also say, if you have any thoughts on, and that if you enter into the question box, is any ideas you may have about the rollout and implementation of the policy. We had a great call with some NGOs last week. They had some really good ideas about what would be helpful in the context within which they were working, and how they, as organisations, have already been starting to think about the policy. So anything that you can do that you think might be helpful, we're not necessarily going to hold you to it if you put something in the box now, but actually just trying to think how we can work collectively, share ideas, share resources, avoid duplication of effort. Then if you're able to enter those into the boxes, we can start to capture that here at Interaction, and our protection working group task team that's on this issue can start to think about how to bring those things together, that would be really helpful. So I think now we don't seem to have any final questions, so I will just let Jenny and Brooke say a few words in closing. Brooke, is there any final comments that you would like to make before we finish today?
I mean, I think that the thing with this policy that is really important is that it can be used to help promote better protection outcomes, and I think I think collectively it would be good if we can embrace that and really kind of, you know, take it for what it can provide in terms of pushing accountability, pushing more attention to protection issues, pushing the HCs and the HCTs to really take this on board. I think there's a lot of tools out there that can contribute to that, but this is I would say nicely packaged sort of overarching more operational statement of the centrality of protection and that commitment, and I think it's something that we would hope that NGOs really take on board as well, in terms of taking it down to the field level, ensuring that when you're arguing for these things to be addressed, that this can be a helpful way to draw that attention that you need. So I think, sort of building on what Liz was saying as well about having ideas about how to look through the rollout of the policy, looking at implementation, that it would be really great to sort of see those conversations continue, and I think definitely for those of us who are not sitting in the field locations to be able to kind of link together to make sure it's being used in the most effective way possible.
Yeah, I think I would echo everything Brooke said and really emphasize the point that implementation of this policy should be a means to an end, not an end in itself. And I think in most countries, you know, people are you know, struggling to you know, mobilize attention and strategies addressing some pretty serious protection issues, and the protection policy indeed should be a tool to do that. So I think we do need that dialogue also between field and those of us working in HQ offices, so that we can sort of build momentum in a mutually reinforcing way. So I think we need those open channels of dialogue internally within individual organizations and collectively, as we're discussing today, to look at how to tackle these protection issues, how to work towards protection outcomes, and making use of this policy and its implementation as a means to do so.
Thanks, Jenny. We'll bring the webinar to a close now, but I will keep the webinar open and the question box open for about 5 minutes after the webinar, so that you can add any final comments you might have or any thoughts that you'd like to feed into us. That would be really helpful. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our speakers, Jenny and Brooke, today, not only for giving us some excellent insights during the webinar today, but also for their work and the work of the wider task team in getting this policy to the point it is today. It was a huge amount of work, and we're grateful for the task team for that. As I said at the beginning of the session, we have recorded the webinar today, and I will be sending out a link shortly. So if there are any bits that you want to watch back, or indeed if you'd like to share it with your colleagues, we'd really appreciate that, so that it can be shared more widely. And we will also be working on developing a more concise version of the presentation that we delivered today, so that it can be used in different contexts for people who are seeking to engage their colleagues and other parts of their organisation as regards to the protection policy. As I said at the beginning, I'm Liz Bloomfield, and I'm the primary point of contact here at Interaction on the policy. You will have my contact details from the various emails that I've sent out with the invitation to this webinar. But at any point to contact me if you have questions about the policy, or indeed if there are aspects of rollout and implementation that your organisations that you think it would be useful to connect in with the work of other NGOs, then please do let me know. We'd really appreciate any insight that you can give us on what would be helpful and the work that you're doing. So thank you. So with that, I will close the webinar today, and as I said, I'll leave the question box open for a few more minutes. If you have any final comments, please do pop them in there, and then we will look forward to engaging with you all in the coming weeks as we progress with the rollout and implementation. Thanks for taking the time today, and have a good day.
Thank you.